I would like to discuss genetically engineered bovine growth hormone, which is injected into cows to increase milk supply, since milk is such a popular topic today.
No.
How many people have heard of bovine growth hormone? All right. So this was originally introduced by Monsanto, and it was approved by the FDA in 1994 while Michael Taylor was in charge of FDA policy. Michael Taylor was Monsanto's former attorney. So he was overseeing the approval process. Margaret Miller worked for Monsanto and did research on bovine growth hormone, and then took a position as the director of a branch of the FDA, which then reviewed her research. Susan Setchen did contract work for Monsanto on research on bovine growth hormone, and then became the FDA's chief reviewer. So it was a setup. I talked to Dr. Richard Burroughs, who had worked at the FDA at the time, and he was the only one who was competent in dairy cows. And he was a veterinarian, and he was looking at the research requirements being put forth by the FDA to Monsanto. There was actually 4 companies vying to produce a bovine growth hormone. And he was shocked because it was simply not sufficient. And he ordered more research and then was fired because he was slowing down the approval process. He sued the FDA, and in the trial, his superior admitted that it was a setup to kick him out. So the FDA was forced to take him back, but then put him on chickens and never let him access any of the data on bovine growth hormone. I talked to a former Monsanto scientist who told me that 3 of his colleagues had done the safety studies on the milk from the cows treated with bovine growth hormone. And after doing the studies, the 3 Monsanto scientists refused to drink milk thereafter unless it was organic. One bought his own cow. Their main concern was the high levels of IGF-1, insulin-like growth factor 1. In the milk, there's more pus because there's more mastitis, an udder infection. There's more antibiotics used, so there's more antibiotics in the milk as well as potentially antibiotic-resistant bacteria. There's more bovine growth hormone in the milk. But the thing that was of most concern was the IGF-1. IGF-1 is in milk. When we drink milk, we increase the levels of IGF-1 in our blood, in our system. Premenopausal women with high levels of IGF-1 are 7 times more likely to develop breast cancer. Men with high levels are 4 times more likely to get prostate cancer. It's also linked to colon cancer. It's one of the highest risk factors for cancer. What it does is it causes cells to divide. So it may not initiate the cancer, but it's like pouring kerosene on a fire to speed it up. It also promotes fraternal twins. It promotes the production of additional eggs as well as increases the survival rate for the eggs. So fraternal twins are higher when there's more IGF-1. In fact, someone from Columbia University, who is an expert at twins, wrote a paper in the Journal of Reproductive Medicine in 2006, which concluded that the reason why the United States has a much higher rate of increase in fraternal twins compared to the UK is because of the use of bovine growth hormone in the dairy industry. You see, UK and Europe in general have banned bovine growth hormone, as has Japan, Australia, New Zealand, most industrialized countries. Canada was looking at bovine growth hormone, and the Director General of Health Canada was going to approve it simply because it was approved in the United States. But a scientist, Shiv Chopra, said, you can do that because you have the right, but I will let Canada know that we did no evaluation. So his insubordination was ultimately rewarded with him being able to oversee a review of the FDA's approval of bovine growth hormone. And they wrote a paper called the Gaps Analysis Report, showing that it basically was a facade. They took the industry's conclusions at face value, never looked at research that showed serious problems in mice, and they treated it as an animal drug, ignoring entirely the fact that humans would be drinking the milk from the animals that were treated. Richard Burroughs told me in an interview that the industry rigged their research to try and pull a fast one over on the FDA. And he described specifically many ways how they did that. One way that Monsanto's friends rigged research was referenced in an unprecedented article written by FDA scientists in Science, defending the approval of bovine growth hormone. And they said that there is no significant increase in bovine growth hormone in the milk, but it doesn't matter even if there were, because it's just 90% is destroyed during pasteurization. Well, there was actually a 37% increase in the hormone in the milk, which was pretty significant, but actually they didn't look at Monsanto's hormone. They looked at a different hormone that was competing with Monsanto that used 2% of the dose and did it on a daily basis instead of every 2 weeks. So it was a completely different drug. Then they referenced this 90% being destroyed during pasteurization. The researchers who did that pasteurized the milk 120 times longer than normal pasteurization. They only destroyed 19% of the hormone. So they added powdered hormone in huge amounts, 147 times the natural occurring level. Heated it 120 times longer than normal. Under those artificial conditions, 90% was destroyed during pasteurization. And that's what the FDA reported. So right now, Monsanto sold off bovine growth hormone to the veterinary division of Eli Lilly, Elanco. So Elanco sells the bovine growth hormone, and to a lot fewer dairies now than 10 years ago because of a tipping point. And bovine growth hormone increases the IGF-1 in the milk. Increased levels of IGF-1 are linked to breast cancer, and Eli Lilly sells breast cancer medicine. So they're milking cancer. So I wanted to share this information because it is a genetically engineered drug. They took E. coli, put in cow genes, turning the bacteria into a factory to produce this hormone inexpensively. And then they rushed it through the approval process with insufficient testing. Canada, by the way, ended up banning it. And Shiv Chopra was in a meeting with the other scientists, meeting with the Monsanto representative, and said that Monsanto offered them a bribe of $1 to $2 million if they approved it. They went on national television saying that they had been offered a bribe. And Monsanto said, oh, no, you misunderstood an offer for research money. Now, to avoid drinking milk with products from cows treated with bovine growth hormone, you can look at the carton, and it says either organic, they're not allowed to use RBGH, or it'll say no RBGH, or no RBST, or no artificial hormones. All of them mean the same thing. Now, on the carton is also a sentence which says, according to the FDA, there's no significant difference in the milk from cows treated with bovine growth hormone compared to those that were not treated. Now, that sentence was written by Michael Taylor, Monsanto's former attorney, as a white paper and as a suggestion. It was never required. But once it was written, Monsanto used that to sue dairies, initially, who had claimed that their products did not have RBGH, putting 1 or 2 dairies out of business, and more recently convinced some states to require that on any milk carton that says no RBGH. So even though it's not true, According to the FDA documents, there's more pus, there's more antibiotics, there's more bovine growth hormone, and there's more IGF-1. You may read this false statement written by Michael Taylor on the milk products in the store. There's also cheese and yogurt and other dairy products that can be made from this treated cows. Fortunately, we've been educating parents about the health dangers, and Walmart kicked it out, Starbucks, Yoplait, Dannon, most American dairies. So it is a success story. It's still legal in the United States, but its use is dramatically reduced. So if you still drink milk after today, look for the organic, which is better than all of them. Okay. and Brian will pray for you. Thank you.
Richard, do you want to take a few moments to just summarize your thoughts after what you spoke about today, or anything on your mind that you want to add?
Well, sure. First of all, greetings, everyone. What a number of awareness. Greetings, everyone, and what a number of awareness warriors we have here. I like that. Yeah, I'm very encouraged. So, yeah, just. First of all, a quick side note, I would highly suggest dispelling of dairy products simply because of their effect on our environment as well. So it's very important to have a good feel for that. But I would prefer to answer anything actually that anybody would like to ask, that I would have some information to be able to offer, because I rarely have an opportunity to entertain questions. Usually I'm at the other end in terms of writing and lecturing, and at some of my universities that I speak at, we do have some interchange, but I'm very honored, to be here to answer any questions. I don't have anything specific that I'd like to talk about, otherwise I'd be here for about another three weeks. So,
Brian, do you want anything you want to open up with?
Tonight's panel, we're going to speak about the future on planet Earth. And of course, pertinent to you and I is the future of humanity on planet Earth.
All those in favor of a future for humanity on planet Earth, raise your hand. Thank you. Okay.
So I'm not going to say any more, but I want to stay very focused. And Stephen, take it away, and why don't you address your question specifically to one of us or to the group, however you want to do it.
Okay, so the first question would be for Jeffrey. Let's assume that people listen to you and they go, oh, and people hear, and we're live streaming it, and people will see the video of this on the internet at some point in the future. And let's assume that people listen to what you say and say, yeah, that sounds good. You speaks very well. It's all very logical, but I'm pretty busy. I got a lot going on. I got a lot to worry about. I'm concerned about the economy. I can't worry about genetically modified foods, and I'm sure someone's going to take care of it. So assume that we do nothing. Assume we say you speak well, but we're going to do nothing. We're not going to change. We're not going to sign petitions. We're going to do nothing, and we're going to just we'll see how it goes. We're doing nothing. So if we do nothing, in 5 years from now, or in 10 years from now, or in 15 years from now, what is exactly the problem? Assume we do nothing. I mean, is everything going to just, be okay, but we'll have a couple of allergies? What exactly should we be concerned about in 5, 10, 15, 20 years if we do nothing and actually continue to expand to more GMO products?
Great question. Yeah. Great question.
It's a horrible question. It's a great question, but it's a horrible question. So the biotech industry has all these different products in the pipeline. The USDA just came out with an environmental impact statement giving the green light. There's a comment period, so it's not officially deregulated yet, but giving the green light to 2,4-D tolerant soy and corn. Now, 2,4-D is half the component of Agent Orange. It is a weed killer, it is a neurotoxin, and it is extremely dangerous. It is acutely dangerous. It can be vaporized. Once it's sprayed, it can be vaporized and lift off the ground and move and land on other crops or people or children or playgrounds or reservoirs. It's responsible for more crop damage than any other weed killer. And when Roundup-ready crops were introduced, the use of Roundup dramatically increased. The use of herbicides in general went up about 527 million pounds over the first 16 years. Charles Benbrook, a very noteworthy scientist in agriculture, calculated that with 2,4-D crops approved, the use of 2,4-D would go up 25 times. 25 times. So that's just one product, 2,4-D. They have a dicamba-resistant crop that they want to approve, which is another acute neurotoxin. They have another one that was just approved. They have all of these chemical seed combinations which will end up drenching our agricultural land, getting into our water supply, into the air. Roundup is found in 60 to 100% of the air samples in the Midwest, in the rain samples, in the surface water. It's found in the groundwater. It's found in our urine. So if we just look at the chemical side, we're talking about dramatic uptick in serious health issues. And of course, children are most at risk. Pregnant women are most at risk because during the time of gestation, there are certain windows where certain parts of the fetus develop, and if there's toxins introduced at that point, then there could be very specific birth defects, brain damage, etc. We're already seeing the RX generation now. We could expect that to accelerate dramatically. Then there's the crops themselves that can produce allergens, toxins, anti-nutrients that are never evaluated, and they will go on the market, and they may be producing already serious problems like we discussed today. Basically, all the diseases of the Western diet can be exacerbated. And then, in 20 years or so, if people then finally realize the folly of GMOs, if they've replaced nature, if the pipelines have emptied, then we have every fruit and vegetable, every nut, every grain, trees. They want to genetically engineer out the mothering instinct from livestock so that they're not concerned when their children are taken away in these factory farms. They want to, because they haven't designed agriculture to meet nature's needs, they want to design nature to meet agribusiness needs. So what we're looking at is really not only replacement of nature, but I would say in very large measure a death of nature. And along with that, very serious health problems. And as far as nature goes, it may be irreversible at that point when the seed stock has been replaced. So that's you better ask a happy question soon, because it's like, that's really a science fiction doomsday analysis.
Okay, thank you.
Let me ask a question. What is the likelihood of that potentially occurring?
So the likelihood is actually getting less and less all the time. I mentioned earlier Cheerios announced last week that it's non-GMO. We have the Hartman Group found 16%, then 25%, then 39% of Americans over 2007, 2010, and last year avoiding GMOs. The anti-GMO sentiment has erupted into demands for labeling. New York State has a labeling bill that's before a committee in February. Go to the table to find out the details. Right now, we are seeing all of the signs of a tipping point. I could speak on that for 20 minutes. And so what I'm seeing is in the United States, the consumers are going to win, but there's a fiercely, let's give a hand to consumers, top of the food chain. We're the top of the food chain. And I see a fiercely pitched battle taking place in India and China and other places in South America. I've been to 37 countries speaking about this, and we want to quickly export the successful methods from the Institute to as many countries as we can. So I would say it's extremely doubtful that that will happen, but I don't want anyone to be complacent. We still need to take action.
Thank you. Dr. Oppenlander, you spoke this morning, and you got a standing ovation when you were done. A lot of people were very impressed. But they weren't impressed enough to actually stay to hear you tonight because some people left. So some people are thinking like, that was a great speech, you speak beautifully, your book is wonderful, but, you know, whatever. There's going to be 8 or 9 billion people on the planet in the next, whatever they say, 20, 30 years, whatever. They're saying that all these countries, as they're raising their economic standard, are eating more and more animal products. So unlike Jeffrey, who said that the tipping point's going in our favor, there's nothing to really indicate that people are about to change. So let's assume everyone says, I'm not reading that book. It's 350 pages. I'm not watching your video. I'm not listening to your conference. We're going to do nothing. I don't worry about this stuff. I'm not one of those people that worries. I'm going to do nothing. Nothing at all. So
Steve, you're a real downer. I just want you to know.
I want to just understand why we're here and what the real concern is. So if someone says, we're going to leave things as they are, plus there's going to be a lot more people, which is definitely happening. That's not in debate. And these countries are definitely eating more animal products. That's not in debate. So if people aren't listening to your message, what is the outcome? Because, you know, a lot of people thinking it's still 72 degrees, things are pretty good, and there's a lot of channels on the internet to watch, and you can, you know, things aren't so bad. So, you know, what is the big deal? So what are you saying if nothing changes that you're so concerned about in the next 10, 20, or 30 years that you realistically think could happen that we should be concerned about?
Yeah, great question. Absolutely. That's sort of the heart of the entire problem, isn't it? First of all, the book is 486 pages, so they probably they'll probably have difficulty for the remainder 130 if they can't even get to that. So, no, actually, you've sort of struck on the essence of the problem. Is that we have an insidious disaster that's occurring all around us, but typically it's human nature to live within a certain microcosm or a bubble, as you're alluding to, which is simply what's essentially right in front of themselves on their own plates. So there are a number of, first of all, let's talk about a number of disconnects that occur so that we can have a better platform of understanding of where we need to go and then what the time frames are that you're talking about or alluding to. I think there are a couple major disconnects that first have to be understood and appreciated and then managed. One is the disconnect that simply the choices you make in general in life can have a major impact on something else in the world. That's essentially true with any decision you make, rather than just inside your own confines. The second disconnect, once you get past that point, is that the most important category of disconnect that has the most profound effect is that of your food choice, more than any other choice you make. However, the third aspect of that, or the third disconnect, is actually the most important, which takes what I just mentioned and branches it into the to the final component, which is the most profound, and that is that the most important critical effect that we have on our planet is the choice of foods as it's related to animal products. Now, so the problem is that many of the tipping points that are involved in various aspects of global depletion, those categories that I spoke about earlier and that are in my book, they're already underway, and we won't really. It's human nature not to really be all that concerned about something until they stumble across it, or until it affects them themselves, or until they're forced or coerced into understanding it through economic means or some tragedy. And we're very soon going to have to most likely be involved in both of those. The timelines that are upon us can be specified for each area of global depletion, but the most important ones are probably climate change and water scarcity. And so the difficulty is that those timelines are not something that I just created. They're present. You can Google most of it, and yeah, they're out there. I'm not a genius and have contrived something. So the problem is that there are certain barriers in place, various cultural influences, political influences, and economic influences, primarily cultural and economic and political, that create these veils or barriers to not only to manage the problems correctly, but most importantly to provide us with information so that it would empower us to make the right decisions on our own. So, and I think that's the most critical issue is that they're obscuring these not only information, but the timelines that are associated with it, because they're the ones that are essentially behaving in the manner that you're speaking of. They're feeling as if they can, there are many organizations and institutions and individuals that are aware of bits and pieces or components of everything that I speak about, but they just don't want to put it together correctly, and they don't want to face they want to take the easy way out. For instance, but let's just pick climate change. The timeline has clearly been spelled out by the International Energy Agency. It's been spelled out by the Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change. It's spelled out every single year in our global climate change conferences, which is essentially a 2 to 3 year window of time from now to drastically reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and you can look up the percentages, but essentially from the 1990 to 1996 era of or range of greenhouse gas emissions, and we have to reduce those drastically by the year 2017, or we'll never be able to get it back. So what's happening is that they pick the easiest. I think it's the easiest target, which is fossil fuel. They can pick on that type of big business and deal with energy reduction, and they can use their baby steps and their reduction techniques and using less of some of these things, sort of steamrolling off of Al Gore's Inconvenient Truth topics. But it's very difficult for them to confront the major aspects of, or the major component, which is the contribution from of greenhouse gases and climate change from eating animals and raising and harvesting and then consuming animals. So I think the timeline for climate change is the most important, because that will affect it's affecting us now, and it's going to have trickling effect, and it'll have various components that are affecting agriculture and human health. Really, it's quite an umbrella of a topic, and then also with water scarcity, which is maybe not in the next 3 years, but it's occurring right now in terms of drought. Drawing of aquifers with the large percentages being drawn for, instead of just agriculture, it's being applied towards animal agriculture, and I think that's going to take place over the next 15 years. So what's going to happen is that they'll continue, humanity or the human species in general will continue on their path until they're confronted with enough chaos and enough devastation where something will be on some politician's desk, or enough of us will make the change, which is what I'm hoping for on a grassroots basis, to where we'll stay one step ahead of it. But these timelines are, to be very specific about your question, the timelines are very clear. It's within 3 years for climate change, within maybe 10 to 15 years for water scarcity, and of course land use is a large issue, and we're basically drawing off of our oceans to the point and affecting our oceans to the point where we're losing our climate regulatory mechanisms there as well. So I want to point out, though, the difficulty is not only living within these microcosms, but the fact that the information is being suppressed, mismanaged, and it's because of the habits or the cultural aspects of those with platforms that can actually make a difference. And I term it, we have to educate the educated, almost more so than we need to educate ourselves.
Brian, thank you. Brian, a lot of us listen to all this nutrition information about the concerns about salt and sugar and fat and animal products and refined products and chemicals, and we say, you know what, my parents lived to like 80, and I eat healthier than them, so I guess if they live to like 80, I'm good to like at least 86. So pretty much everyone's thinking like, we're really, as much as you're saying all these scary things about food, really it's not that big a concern, because certainly we know that people are living longer than ever, we're told, and we're probably going to live longer than our parents. So I guess, the two questions would be, one, why should we be so concerned? Because we're eating better than our parents, we tell ourselves that, and they live to like 80. And then the second would be, if someone was born today, what's so different? I mean, what do you think they're going to experience? What levels of health issues do you think they're going to have in their first 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, 30, 50, that's different than today? Because I guess the summation of talking to most people is it's not really that bad enough in front of them. Their parents are still alive. Their uncle lived to 88. So they feel like all this stuff about chemicals and GMOs and processed food, can't be that bad. So, are we, tell me what.
This is a very, very simple answer for me to make. I'm fortunate to be on the front line of catastrophic changes every day of my life. From the time I was a young man and extremely concerned about the plummeting health of humans worldwide, I must have gotten a little calmer because things are probably 4 times worse in 4 decades. It used to be much easier at the Institute to deal with people my age and in their 70s and 80s with cancer because we've had a life. But now the statistics and my massive experience shows that what used to take 50, 60, 70 years to contract, we contract in 5 to 10 years because of genetic modification, because of cell phones, because of the consumption of meat and dairy food. Number 2, your grandparents lived on a pristine planet. In the earlier panel, I pointed out that tomorrow Dr. Anna Maria is going to be showing you a graph that in 1980 was not the Dark Ages, it was 30 years ago, that the developed countries were significantly sicker than the under or undeveloped countries. Currently, the undeveloped countries are as sick as we are. To make it very clear, there's going to be wars because we are going to run out of water in the next 15 to 20 years. As Dr. Oppenlander writes so articulately in one of his books, that the largest pure water aquifer on the planet Earth is in the western part of the United States. He may correct me, but I think it supplies the water for 17 states. And 70 to 80% of that water goes on raising animals so people can get sick and have heart attacks, strokes, cancers, and the list goes on and on and on. This is insanity that we have right here at the United Nations, blocks from here, extremely important discussions on a yearly basis about global warming, and not one person stands up and discusses the meat and dairy issue. That is conservatively 30% of all of that problem, and possibly 40 to 50% of it. And then we could have a whole nother conference on why heart disease, cancer, multiple sclerosis, Parkinson's disease, diabetes, Lou Gehrig's disease, and the list goes on, is skyrocketing. You may not be in an office with patients seeing people as I am every day. Let me promise you, diseases that were non-existent when I was a boy are now catastrophic diseases. Your grandparents grew up in an organic world. The first person that ever supported me when I went home and announced to my New York area parents that I gave up meat and dairy food, they actually thought I had gone bonkers. They knew I was crazy to begin with, but they really thought this was it. He must be suicidal now. Because corporate interests have so embedded in your minds, and even some of you sitting here struggle with this currently, that if you don't eat meat, you're going to starve of protein deficiency. The day I stopped starving of protein deficiency is the day I gave up meat. If you don't take dairy food, that you're actually going to have bones crumble. The day I gave dairy food up, I began to lose more than 100 pounds. And forget what it did physically, because why we should eat this way is for consciousness, awareness. If you come out of the darkness and the negativity and the depressed state of mind that doing the wrong thing puts you in, not only morally, but I mean biochemically, you will start to become part of the solution. If you come to conferences like this and listen to conferences like this on the internet today or 20 years from now, and you're not part of the solution, shame on you. So we cannot compare grandparents. My grandmother came to me when I announced I'd be a vegan and said, "It's okay, I know you're not going to be sick because I guess I was a vegan when I was a little girl." In my grandmother's generation, people did not eat copious amounts of meat and dairy. As a matter of fact, statistically, we eat in every socioeconomic group in the last 4 generations 4 times more meat and 4 times more dairy. The only people that ate meat and dairy in those days in large amounts were the aristocracy, the very wealthy. And who were the sick people? We have the data. This isn't speculation. If I went to Sloan Kettering and pulled out data from 1900, you'd see what neighborhoods those people were coming from. And the peasants, most of our families, by the way, were not sick. They were eating plant-based organic diets. So comparing what we have now and try to lie to the public and say that we live longer, this is insanity at its highest degree. I challenge any doctor, any statistician on the planet Earth to debate me on this one. How they manipulate you on those numbers is it was very common for babies to die at birth or within 1 year. And that was extremely common. At one point, 1/4 of babies born in families, remember families were 10, 12, 15 children, died before they were 1. My aunts, my grandparents would say, "Oh, I remember the twins. They were so cute. They died at 9 months old. I remember my poor little brother. We got to see him for a day." This was a common story. Now, modern medicine's not all bad. We're not here to beat up all modern medicine. Modern medicine is really good in one area, diagnostics. Once they diagnose you, run. Because they sure don't know the remedy, but the diagnosis is great. And they started to look into women's bodies when they were pregnant and saw an umbilical cord around the neck, and the baby was turned in the wrong direction, a breached child, and that's why babies were dying. And conditions were not sterile, not that hospitals are today, but there was a period until 25 years ago where hospitals were much more sterile than the average home. And how many of you know that you have a much higher rate of infant mortality at hospitals giving birth than you do with home births? And if you say, "I'm going to have a home birth," oh my God, you're like Satan. They're going to tell you, no, not. And I'm not suggesting to have that without a professional, a midwife, a doctor involved in it. But, everything is skewed. So we don't live longer today. How can we when half of us this year, 2014, America will have cancer as our #1 disease killer? Still, 48% of us will die of a heart attack or stroke. Diabetes has tripled in the last generation. And our children contract 2 times more diabetes than grown adults. 72% of our children are overweight, obese, or morbidly obese. If you saw what Dr. Deal showed, he only showed every 5 years. I do that with a film every year. The increase in obesity in the United States from 1980 on. It is stunning. It's shocking when you see this. Stunning and shocking. And obesity is where genetic modification, fat, is going to maintain itself, and where heavy metals and chemicals are going to maintain themselves. And this is going to create disease, mental and physical disease. So I challenge anyone who's lethargic and passive, who thinks that some magic is going to happen, to realize that you're insane. That the only magic that's going to happen if you awaken and start to do something.
Thank you, Brian. Jeffrey, I'd like to ask you 2 questions. One, I don't have a background in your subject matter, and I'm just like anyone else in the audience. I read the paper, I look, and every now and then I see an article on GMOs, and it says that the biotech and other people have said that we need them, and we need chemicals to raise enough food that we're just, the population's growing all over the world, and we need to grow a lot of food, and with the growing population, the responsible thing to do is to use lots of chemicals because That helps grow more food, and we need GMOs. And on top of that, there's even some places like, I don't know where, sure if they said the Philippines, that they had developed a golden rice that had more of a certain vitamin that was lacking. So they were making the article that not only do we need GMOs to feed a growing world, but they have special characteristics that might give us certain vitamins that we might need. So that's the first question. And then the second question would also be, there's a lot of smart, hardworking people. There's a lot of people like, let's say, Bill and Melinda Gates. They don't need money. They'd like to do good things in the world. Why can't we convince some of these people in their 60s, 70s, 80s who want to have a legacy, who want to do the right thing? If this was so true, why can't we convince some of them to be leaders and speak out? If they don't have a money motivation, why can't we get them? Why is it so hard for them to take the mantle and say, hey, this is a real issue?
Feeding the world. This is the public relations angle for GMOs. And if it were true that GMOs could feed the world, then they would have to, one, increase yield, and increased yield would have to be the way to feed the world, and they'd have to be reliable and safe. And they'd have to be better than alternative technologies that were at least as safe. They fail all of those tests. The ISTAD report was sponsored by the United Nations, the World Health Organization, and 10 more international organizations. It was signed on by 58 countries. It was written by more than 400 scientists. And it is the most comprehensive evaluation of agriculture and feeding the world ever done. And the authors of that study, and I've interviewed several, including the co-chairman, state unequivocally that genetic engineering, the current generation, has nothing to offer their goals of feeding the world, eradicating poverty, or establishing sustainable agriculture. One of the co-chairs said it's basically a technology looking for a solution. First of all, it doesn't increase yield. The Union of Concerned Scientists wrote a report, Failure to Yield, showing that it doesn't increase yield. In fact, most GMOs reduce yield. Sustainable methods of agriculture increase yield in developing countries. There was a study done on over 12 million farms that found a 79% increase in yield. And in some staples like corn and potatoes, 100%. So you have GMOs which don't increase yield on average, and you have sustainable methods. Then you also have monoculture versus polyculture. If you look at sustainable methods that combine different crops on the acre, they have more nutrition per acre and far more yield that's edible. But the industrial agricultural model ignores everything other than one crop, and so it can skew the results. Rodale Institute grew side by side organic, soy and corn, and conventional, and then GMO, and found that there was no difference in that monoculture in yield, except in times of bad weather when organic outperformed the GMOs. It turns out, however, that yield is not the key for feeding the world, because we have more food per person than any time in human history, and 1 billion people go to bed hungry or malnourished. It's access to food, it's poverty issues, which are more critical. In addition, GMOs are unreliable, because the practice of genetic engineering creates unpredicted side effects, and these new traits create unpredicted effects with the environment. We see catastrophes all the time. The poster child, unfortunately, for the catastrophe is India, where Monsanto came in and took over the cottonseed industry. They promoted a genetically engineered cotton seed, or set of cotton seeds, claiming it would basically be the way to riches. And because it's unreliable, sometimes it doesn't even germinate, sometimes it produces smaller bolls, cotton bolls, or the bolls fall off, or there's root rot, or leaf curl, or infestation of mealybugs, or the quality of the cotton is lower, or it requires more labor. Many, many farmers are unable to pay back their high interest loans that they take from loan sharks at a 7% interest per month. As a result, they commit suicide. Not all of them, but over 250,000. Who planted... Right, I'm going to be clear with that. Farmers in India have seen at least 284,000 suicides. That's the official tally by the government. And the vast majority are farmers that planted Bt cotton and were unable to pay back their loans. So it is an absolute catastrophe. In addition, GMOs work against feeding a hungry world because they take money and resources away from the more appropriate technologies. So that's the feeding the world answer. Golden rice is the poster child of the biotech industry saying, see, you have to be for the entire technology of genetic engineering because someday we'll find a GMO that has a solution. And the solution that they say is we need more vitamin A in the children of developing countries. That's true. But their technology is terrible for delivering vitamin A. It's a disaster. It produces a precursor to vitamin A called beta-carotene, which typically requires fat in the diet in order to process. The malnourished children who have no access to vitamin A typically have no access to the fat. Also, the beta-carotene, when it's produced, the metabolic pathway can produce retinoic acid, which is linked to some very serious diseases. So you might cure someone of vitamin A and kill them with something else. In fact, the process of genetic engineering yields unpredicted side effects. So you might have an oncogene that turns on, so you have a carcinogen or a toxin or an allergen in the crop that you're feeding to these kids. While there are other technologies available, like Vitamin Angel gives 2 pills a year to kids with mega doses of vitamin A and prevents blindness. There are other organizations that teach people how to create gardens. So they're not just creating the vitamin A that they need, but they're creating a full, balanced, nourished diet. In addition, there's already a red rice with more vitamin A in it than golden rice that's natural. But it's not the sexy new technology that you can patent, and so it's ignored. So this vitamin A golden rice is just a PR scheme. Finally, you end up with people like Bill Gates, who I heard speak a few years ago. He was approached by the Rockefeller Foundation. The Rockefeller Foundation is the promoter of golden rice. They're the promoter of the GMO myths. And they surrounded Gates with their myth-making. And if you look at Gates's words, he holds up Pamela Ronald's book, Tomorrow's Table, as one of the most influential books that he's read. It is a disaster of science. It is basically a biased myth-making book. It's mythology. And it's easily knocked down. But what happens is, even though the biotech industry is not great at making safe products, they're very good at creating myths in such a way that they insulate those who are converted and those believe that anyone who's against GMOs, those of us who are calling for more science, we're anti-science. So in the words of Dan Glickman, who was the Clinton administration Secretary of Agriculture, he was actually promoting GMOs throughout Europe. He said, what I saw generically from the pro-biotech side was the attitude that the technology was good, and it was almost immoral to say that it wasn't good, because it was going to feed the hungry and clothe the naked. And if you're against it, you're Luddites, you're stupid. And that, frankly, was the side our government was on. He said you felt like you're almost disloyal or an alien by trying to present an open-minded view. He said this attitude was written into his speeches. And he diverted from his speech once and actually raised reasonable points about labeling and other things about GMOs. And he said he was slapped around by the industry and the Clinton administration and feared for his job. So this ability to create a groupthink is something that the biotech industry excels at enormously. Fortunately, we're not all part of that groupthink, and we don't need the majority of Americans to tip the scales. So we don't, I mean, it would be nice to have Bill Gates' money, although he has 500,000 shares in Monsanto. I don't think I'm going to get any.
Steve, can I add something
Sure.
to that? I think, sorry, I don't know if this is going to throw you off at all, but that was very well stated for a number of reasons. But I wanted to maybe add something, I think, to help clarify. First of all, you explained yield very well, but I do think that we need to maybe modify it even further, because I think that where we get into trouble with the word yield is still looking at short game, still looking at what is right in front of us. And in terms of solving world hunger and how it may be applicable in the United States, for instance, but especially more on a global, a much larger perspective in terms of the human species or survival of our species, is that yield needs to be redefined in terms of long-term projection. We need to look at what can be produced in the healthiest manner with the least amount of resources, with the least amount of death, and the least amount of pain and agony over a long period of time in order to achieve sustainability. So yield really has been completely malaligned and misdefined for so many years, and I think that's one of the key reasons. And secondly, I think that is really important to understand is that I'm going to try to help thread a little bit further what he said about the myth and how it applies to world hunger. I've been involved in I've been honored to be involved in a few nonprofit organizations. They're the only ones that I know of in the world that are working with purely plant-based solutions to world hunger. One of them happens to be in Mozambique, and I think that I'm still always trying to find the positive in just about every aspect. So I think that Bill Gates, really does want to have a legacy of helping humanity. I just think that he is misguided, like many of the rest of the world, and but he's very misguided. And with his ability financially and in terms of his influences, it's even more of a sad issue than what you can imagine. In terms of world hunger, for instance, and how this can be threaded together with what Jeffrey was saying about GMO and some of the larger businesses involved, Monsanto, et cetera, is that in 2009, very quickly in Rome, I mean, that's when they first started really being concerned about projections of food security issues with the calculations of how many people, 9 billion people by the year 2050 and 8.5 billion people by the year 2030, and with meat and dairy products projected to double between now and then, with diminishing resources, without really putting it together, the 1 + 1 = 2, in terms of, why are we running into all these serious resource depletion issues? Well, their solution was to I guess set aside and project $22 billion. It hasn't been realized yet, but $22 billion to be placed into specific world hunger funds. And it was then again realized in terms of, or stated that they will do it again in 2012 with world leaders, with G8 leaders. The issue is that the propaganda that's been placed in front of us with GMOs and large businesses have now worked their way through these large funders, USAID, and all of the major participating G8 influences, so that the main thrust of solving world hunger now, with the major funding behind it, is established in sort of a triangle situation. It's the G8 governments supporting and sort of orchestrating funding from 45 major international businesses to then align themselves with, at this point in time, 8 developing countries in Africa, Mozambique being one of them that I'm involved with. And the difficulty is that the businesses that they have created this alignment with are Monsanto and DuPont. And Gates is very much involved in all that because he's been misdirected. So most of the funding now It's very difficult to be able to achieve any funding because those are the wheels of motion now being propagated. And so I think that helps, thread this a little bit. I'll give you just one short example so you can see how serious this is that I don't know if you know much about land grabbing, but there have been a tremendous amount of millions and millions of acres of land being taken up by various countries, China, Japan, Brazil, in developing countries to produce animal-based products. The GMO situation comes into play because they'll all rely on Monsanto for much of their seed inputs. But one of the largest ones that is to date underway is something called Pro Savannah, which is taking 17 million acres from the northern section in Mozambique, 17 million acres purchased on the orchestration of our government with these multinationals, forming a triangle from Japan to the governmental officials of Mozambique with Brazil. And if you look on Gates's website, he's very proud to say that that they are the primary funders of this project to help world hunger. And what it's doing is it's if you look closer, there are petitions now being drawn up by the 4 million peasant farmers that are being displaced in Mozambique that have used that land for some of their they're doing some other things wrong with their pastoral techniques with livestock, but essentially what's happening is through Gates's funding, the United States involvement, some of the other G8 countries, Japan is now partnering up with Brazil and moving, displacing these people in the name of trying to reduce world hunger. And if you look at really what the primary players are in Brazil, they're the ones that have deforested the Amazon. They've gone south now, and they're creating more deforestation in the savannas of the Mato Grosso area and the Cerrado, which is an ancient savanna. And they're actually, deforestation there is occurring at a faster rate than it is in the Amazon area because of the funding of Bill Gates. And most of the crops, to bring it full circle, most of it are either grazing cattle or they are crops to feed cattle, and most of that are soybeans, and they're also being funneled back into China, which is a whole other topic that we can get into later. But I hope that helps, bring this full circle with what he was saying.
Okay, thank you. I'll ask this to any of you, but I've heard Brian talk about this, and I heard Richard in your book. You wrote something about this. I want to stay positive. I don't want to create fear, but I thought that I heard you all say something to the effect that the oceans and forests produce oxygen, and Brian said something I didn't really understand about fish and their effect on something, and you said something about the ocean. So something about like in 2048, which is 35 years ago, we're overfishing, there's going to be no fish, and that was more than just like a problem of not having fish. It was a problem with oxygen. So maybe you guys, maybe I didn't understand it. What are you saying is the problem with the oceans and forests in terms of oxygen and then dying? What exactly is going on, and how bad an issue is this?
Well, with Brian's permission, let me kind of jump in just very quickly, just to give you somewhat of a very good summary of what you're trying to bring into play here. First of all, right, it's not science fiction at all. It's not something that I concocted. It's, again, something that you could spend some time, very minimal time, just Googling and looking in terms of what most scientists who understand, who have the science behind them, are predicting that our oceans, in terms of the large fish and most of the about 1,000 species of fish or types of fish that we're following right now, they can be tracked. They'll be reduced to less than 10% of what their current stocks are. Right now, all large fish, which are including swordfish, tuna, most of the predatory fish, halibut, have already been reduced to 96%. They're 96% gone. They're less than 5% of those numbers left. And that's today. So a number of researchers have predicted that our oceans will be essentially essentially devoid of any life that will be reversible in certainly our lifetime, or most likely over the next 100 years, by the year 2048. And yes, that includes, by that time, because of the complexity of the intertwining, interdependent life systems, we're extracting, essentially, harvesting targeted fish. Most of those were the easiest fish to see and to catch, were the large fish. We're also taking in terms of numbers, we're harvesting pelagic fish, which are the medium depth fish, anchovies, sardines, herring, and then we're also extracting krill, which is the most abundant life on Earth right now, without realizing what it's doing to all the other forms of sea life and the other forms of life that depend on these, that live in and around the oceans, including our whales and seals and et cetera. So, yeah, that's not science fiction. It's something that's predicted by a number of researchers. And one last quick thing about that is, and I mentioned this a number of times in my book. I discuss it, quite well in depth about, again, one of the largest concerns I have is that not only is it not being addressed correctly and the information is being mismanaged or suppressed, but now we're creating curtains in terms of terms which are misused, such as the term sustainable. And so anytime you see a sustainable label, such as by the Monterey Bay Aquarium Seafood Watch, or MSC, it typically means that they are unable to correctly define whatever species they're bringing to your plate in terms of how many there are left. They can't really define or quantify the total sustainable yield, which then leads to the maximum allowable catch, which they are terms that the fishing industry uses. But they, by all means, have no idea what effect that has on all the interrelated, infinite amount of ecosystems that are affected. But they're guided by economics. And one last thing about that, MSC has about 196 fisheries that they've certified. There hasn't been one to date. There's been one that's been questioned, so I have to qualify that, but there has not been one to date that has been declined. And they average about $120 to $150,000 that they're paid. They're set up as a nonprofit organization that originated in the late 1990s from Unilever and World Wildlife Fund, which is an odd combination, but they felt that was what would work, and it's failed miserably. But not in the public's eyes, because the general public is just yearning so badly to find some justification for continuing to eat something that they don't need to eat from a health standpoint. In fact, it's detrimental to them, as Brian will discuss much more with you. But that's a serious issue, and a lot of this is propelled by, again, funding. So anyway, I hope that helps a little bit. And
as Dr. Oppenlander just stated, when I was doing 3 years of research to compile my book, Killer Fish, I was stunned that every single marine biologist and oceanographic scientist of any stature worldwide says the oceans will be dead in the year 2048. How many years is that from now? Listen to what I've said. Dead. Now, many of us probably think trees and bushes and plants give us most of our oxygen. You're wrong. Most of the oxygen on this earth, just like the ocean being about 70% of your oxygen comes from diatoms, plants in the ocean. One of the people I admired most in my life was Jacques Cousteau. I think he wasn't a pioneer in the oceans. I think he was a prophet. And when I heard him speak in 1970, he said, when we kill the diatoms, the human race has little to no time left. That's what's happening. Now, the oceans are a beautiful, perfect, evolutionary, godly, universal ecosystem. And the large fish and the small fish play like the London Symphony together, in perfect harmony, balance. And once we take the violinist off the stage, or the oboist, or the celloist, or the percussionist, it starts to fall apart. And the symphony is no longer playing. And with Dr. Oppenlander, I'm so in admiration that he's speaking about this now, because this has been missed by the food-based community. It's always about chicken, it's always about red meat. No, it's just as important, if not more important. I think it's more important, the fish issue. So this is another little thing to concern yourself about, but I am an optimist. I think that when humans are really in peril, and people do know what's happening, and it's not going to be only we that let this happen. When we start to have 1 foot of water down on Wall Street, when we start to have fighting going on in the United States among fellow Americans because they no longer have food, and they've been conned and trained as consumers that you die if you don't have meat. So they get their guns, which we seem to love in this country, and they start shooting their neighbors. And this is going to happen, because I don't see how this is not going to happen. And you have a population right here, we're speaking, this is the epicenter, 25 million people in this metropolitan area. 25 million people. I happened to live in Boston at one point where they had a crippling snowstorm that paralyzed the city. No planes, no trucks, no cars came in or out for a week. And within 24 hours, every bit of food, they stood in lines for 2-3 blocks, were purchased, and the poor and the elderly were starting to eat cat food. And nothing happened. Nothing happened. I saw this with my own eyes. I'm an optimist. I think things are getting bad. They're getting really bad. And I think we all have to find the tipping point. And the tipping point is you. We may be the authorities, we may be the people that inform you, but again, we're 1 or 2 or 10 or 20 or 30, and the truth about health will give you lots of information, but we need you everywhere on the planet Earth to start to enlist in this army I spoke about earlier. And start to be a walking, living, talking example of what has been discussed over this 3 days. You're part of the problem if you can't change your life. You're part of the problem. So we need you to change your life and to become humane again by self-respect first.
Very good.
Thank you. Brian, I want to follow up on something you said to all three of you. You all speak beautifully. You're articulate, confident, intelligent men who have written books and are wonderful communicators. Should we, in general, assume that you guys got this covered? And as we're going to go home tonight, we want to do our stuff. We're very busy. Everyone's got stuff they got to do. They took time off this weekend. In general, should we assume that, okay, now there's a leader of this, you got this covered, and if we send a petition back now and then by email, then that's enough? Or is that not enough? And if it's not enough, what would be the exact 1 to 5 steps you would like us and anyone who ever sees us, what are the 1 to 5 action steps specifically, if we would listen to you, that you would exactly you'd want us to take?
Can I start briefly? Actually,
Sure.
I think I'd like to summarize.
Sure.
Do you mind that?
Yep.
Just very briefly, I want to say to initiate that for a response for that. You know, I've often said that that I initially thought maybe 20 years from now we will find 2 distinct groups of individuals in the world regarding food choice. One group will be aware, and they'll be consciously living their lives in a way to promote health in all aspects, because they'll be living a life based on a fully plant-based, organic plant-based diet. The second group will be unaware, either constrained by culture or simply won't care. I don't think that we can get away from that other type of group. I don't. That doesn't mean I'm not optimistic. It just, I'm a realist as well. And I have some neighbors that I don't think will be in that group. some deer hunters back in Michigan. So anyway, so I think what's going to happen is that to understand this very well and to use this as somewhat of a platform base when you hear these gentlemen speak about this as well. But what's going to happen is that with these two distinct categories, we'll find that the first 20 years from now, I used to think it would take that long, but the first group of individuals, those conscientious, only eating plant-based foods, will no longer tolerate the ecological imposition placed on them by those that eat animals. Now, the difficulty is that we can't wait 20 years. And the future, what we've been essentially responsible for, saying we as a human species and we all in this room are part of that, is that while it's been on our watch, we've created these timelines that I've been talking about and that we discussed, at least about the oceans here and a little bit about climate change, et cetera. We're responsible. It's happened in the last 50 years, essentially. I mean, it began happening maybe 100 years ago or so, but it's been escalated in the last 30 to 50 years. So it's been on our watch, and this is what we are then transferring to the next generation. So I feel it's our duty to change this. And so I feel whether we're talking about armies from a grassroots objective and force, with enlightenment, empowerment, or it's a top-down approach, which we still, I think, have to advocate for that second group. There's going to have to be some type of taxation or coercion, and I think, if nothing else, we need to then enlighten our policymakers and those with that type of a platform in order to create the environment for this second group of individuals. So my thought would be to do both.
Explain what if we stopped subsidizing the meat, what it would cost.
Yeah, so very good point. You know, when I'm talking about, I mean, this is a very large topic, so the best I can do right now is probably to summarize it. But when we're talking about a top-down approach, we mean both to address and to advocate for there to be, if there's going to be any subsidies that is going to be provided by our government, it shouldn't be for animal-based agriculture, meaning fishing, dairy, or meat. Yeah, it should be entirely for plant-based agriculture, and there's a large topic about that in terms of just switching this around. It doesn't mean to take away subsidies. It means to subsidize those foods that are in the best interest of our planet and for our own health. So that's one approach, and the other approach is to be ambassadors for every single thing that you've heard all of the speakers discuss, and go out and discuss it in just the same vigor as we are doing it here, and empower all those around you, and then we can make this happen. So anyway, if that helps.
I think that there's some epidemics going on of thinking that are at the basis of these problems. Within the scientific and corporate communities, they call it reductionist thinking, which is basically putting blinders on. Within these boundaries, something looks okay. Or in the area where where someone feels appropriate to address, then they can ignore everything on this side and everything on this side, and then incrementally do something, take a step, take an action, discover something. That reductionist thinking is also part of the thinking of genetic engineering, which sees, a gene and a protein, and there's two things that molecular biologists don't know. One is molecules, the other is biology. They don't understand the holistic nature. And the training of scientists these days, and the way training occurs in the United States, for example, is also very much within these boundaries. So and then corporations, of course, they externalize the risks to others, and again, it's a kind of a narrowing. Now, a similar type of boundary is an epidemic where people believe that it's someone else's responsibility, they're handling it, and they're doing a good enough job. This is how it works at the FDA. The FDA says Monsanto will determine if the foods are safe. Someone is handling it, and they're doing a good enough job. When I go to developing countries or any country, they say, we don't have to worry about it because the FDA is handling it. I went to a plant breeder in South Africa who bred sugarcane, and he did a contract for Monsanto to create a genetically modified sugarcane. It was successful, but they buried it because there was no market. And I said, so you do the selection and choose the right strain, and they do the health evaluation. He goes, that's right. I said, so you take 350,000 plants down to one, and they do the long-term animal feeding studies and the human clinical trials. He goes, that's right. I said, they don't. He was suffering from that epidemic that someone else must be handling it, and they must be doing a good enough job. What's happening in the country is on the state level, they're now going after labeling. On the county level, they're banning GM plantings in different counties. And on the individual level is where it's most critical. So this, I think, is the big gift that I'd like to share. And that is, when you think about all of these things that have been presented today and yesterday, what would life be like for you if you took the boundaries down that said someone else is taking care of it and they must be doing a good job, and said, okay, I will take responsibility. Now, the challenge is that doesn't mean you're going to take responsibility for the whole thing, and the other challenge is that you don't want the angst, the anxiety, the suffering, the guilt, the panic that comes when some people think of all these things. So it's that suffering that often keeps those boundaries up. I don't want to think about it, it's too depressing. Someone else will think about it. So the first challenge, and this is the first of the 5, because you said do 5 things, and that is find that place in you where you can take responsibility for your actions, and beyond that, take responsibility in a generous-hearted, generous-minded way of the earth, and do it not feeling like a victim, but feeling like a victor. Do it in such a way that you feel more empowered and stronger, standing up to say, I will help cure this world. Do it in such a way that you become bigger-hearted rather than constricted. This is the first thing, because this will give us the power individually to say, okay, I'm an Earth citizen, what do I need to do? The second step is, what do I need to do? And that really is a self-inventory. Because as you've been listening today, and as you'll listen in the future with these boundaries down, something is going to ring out there and ring inside of you. Someone asked me today, I'm a fine artist, what do I do about GMOs? And I wanted to spend time with her and ask her the questions so that it came out of her. Because it's not a cookie-cutter answer. If you're a healthcare practitioner, if you're a school teacher, if you're a member of the media, if you're a writer, if you're into social media, the answer is completely different. But if you take out the boundaries first and say, okay, bring it on, I'm going to make a difference, And then you listen inside and say, how do I make a difference? How does my network and my community and my footprint make a difference? That becomes the guiding principle for everything else. So that's the second piece. And then within that, you'll find your passion, and your passion becomes contagious, and that's something you should hold on to as a powerful tool. So when I teach, as I've taught 1,000 people to speak on GMOs, I first say, just tell your neighbor about GMOs. I'm not going to give you any story in the beginning, just speak for a minute. And then I say, how many of you spoke about something that was really passionate for you, and that's why you got here? And several hands go up. I say, don't forget that, because you may not hear me talk about that, but that's what got your bell ringing. And you need to bring that into your discussion, even if it's not what I talk about. So, take the boundaries down, figure out what works for you, and ignite your passion and make it available. Fourth, know that you can make a difference, which actually affects everything. I, in 1996, got involved with GMOs. I did not have a science background. I'm not a doctor. I didn't take science in college. I have a master's of business administration. You know from my lectures more than I knew 18 years ago. There's more ways to reach people now than I had 18 years ago. There's more opportunity now to affect change. Each person here, every person that's been on the panel, people that you see, have had enormous impact. I know I have. I've changed national policies in different countries. I've convinced more people in the world to avoid GMOs probably than anyone else. And it was just doing what I wanted to do with passion over and over again. So I wanted to add that to the mix, to know that you don't need permission to be a world leader. Okay, I give you permission, you can be a world leader. If you needed to hear it, you got it. You have my permission. You have Brian's permission, you have Richard's permission to be world leaders. And you don't need to necessarily have someone else's skill set, because how you do it is based on your passion and your skill. The last thing, which is about GMOs, is connect with us. Sign up for our newsletter so we can stay in touch. I'll be sharing with you all the time about ways that you can connect. And we have materials there, Genetic Roulette. The film is the most powerful conversion tool. Please get that. Share it with 1,000 of your closest personal friends. Please share the newsletter as you get it. If you want to be a speaker, get the speaker training. If you want to be an activist locally, join the Tipping Point Network. Most importantly, avoid GMOs yourself. But that's getting involved in helping yourself and then helping others. All the other stuff really is a bigger life lesson that I'm still learning and enjoying and love to share. Thank you.
Well said. Nobody has to add to that. Good for you. Good stuff.
So as often is the case, we don't have endless time to explain every detail and every science study and all the information that we'd like to impart. And here we also have run out of time. If you could each just close with whatever thoughts you want to leave us with regarding any of this information. I'm very grateful to all of you for the work you do, for the books that you've written, for the lectures you give. But for someone out there who's not necessarily familiar with this and might be watching you on video someday, how would you like to close? Would you each take a few moments and say whatever final thoughts you think you'd like to summarize where you're at with all of this and what you'd like to say to someone who might be listening who does not necessarily have as much of a commitment or a background or knowledge about these subjects. So each of you could just take a minute or two to close.
So I'm going to make a case for focusing on GMOs as part of your world leadership. We are at a very critical time right now. As I explained today, the GMO issue may be one of the greatest health and environmental catastrophes we face. As if you look at longevity, genes, including the gene pool, can outlast easily the effects of global warming and nuclear waste. The only thing that lasts longer is extinction. And we are at a time now where the biotech industry is actually feeling up against the wall and pulling out all the stops. But they are up against the wall. People come up to me all the time and say, this whole issue is exploding, and you may see it in your inbox, you may see it in your Facebook page, but it is exploding. Now, it is at the time of transformation when input determines the outcome and the steady state. So if there's a phase transition going on, the information that goes on during the phase transition determines the height of the final curve. In other words, in plain language, this is the time to be involved. You have far more capacity to make changes now with GMOs than any time in the past and possibly any time in the future. The irony, the weirdness is, as we said before, this massive problem may go away if sales of Cheerios goes up because it's non-GMO. And that would make everyone realize, oh, we have to be non-GMO. It's that simple. It is so leveraged. A small percentage of eaters simply need to say no to GMOs. And 53% of Americans say they want to avoid GMOs if labeled, so most people are on our side. So if we only need a small percentage, and most Americans are on our side, we can get rid of GMOs without ever having to convince anyone who's resistant. We give the information to the people who want to hear. And because it is lively in collective consciousness, it's lively in social media, it's lively even in the mainstream media right now, people are more willing to hear the answer, to find out what's going on. So the amplification of every single statement and action related to GMOs is unprecedented. But so too is the necessity. All future generations hang in the balance. Are we going to replace nature with Monsanto's designer organisms, or are we going to protect nature? And so I encourage you to treat this extremely seriously, to take this as precious, a precious opportunity. And I'll end with this. Someone said to me in Taiwan 2 years ago, "Thank you, Mr. Smith, for your bravery." I said, actually, I don't consider myself brave. I define bravery as seeing fear, being fearful, and stepping through it. But I have no fear to do this work. I have an opportunity that is unprecedented in the history of mankind. None of our ancestors have ever had the ability to help protect everyone who eats and all living beings for all future generations, because there's never been a technology that threatened everyone who eats, all living beings, and all future generations. No one in the past could put it on their resume. We have the opportunity to together protect all who eat, all living beings, and all future generations. What an opportunity we have as human beings for the first time in human history. So to me, it's not a question of bravery. It's a question, I am honored to do this work. And I will speak on behalf of all of the GMO activists I've been working with for 17, 18 years. As we support and celebrate nature, it feels directly like nature is celebrating and supporting us at the same time.
Good for you. Yeah. Yeah, that was very well said, don't you think? Yeah. You know, very quickly, when I began my journey in the direction of seeking truth and reality, and in terms of peace and health, and how food affects all of us, and how it affects the world that we live in, it was back in the early 70s. And you know, I think that things have changed so greatly since then in a number of ways. I spoke mostly about some very discouraging things today. My book is replete with very discouraging things, but what I don't want you to take away from my involvement, which I was so honored to be here, is that I want you to find encouragement in what I presented anyway, and in the sense that the way that I found encouragement in the last, I've always been encouraged, but especially in the last 10 to 15 years, where at the same time, it's interesting how that works, isn't it? At the same time that one could feel as disparaged as ever in the history of our planet with how much devastation there is around us, and our contribution to all of that as a species. But at the same time that's occurring, we and somewhat to echo what Jeffrey had said, that we've never really had a better time as humans, as individuals, and collectively to take a movement and do anything greater than to save our planet and save our world. And but again, and what I had said a few times earlier today is that not for ourselves so much, but for all other species on Earth and for all future generations. In fact, in the midst of all this discouragement that I've mentioned, I want you to not only be focused on timelines, because we need to start looking outside of ourselves and outside of the microcosm in front of us, start looking at some of the, realizing and appreciating these timelines that we're on, because they're very real, and they're very narrowed. And once we run through those, I mean, we're doing some irreversible damage to our planet right now, and that can be understated at all. And we are responsible, but at the same time, we can still create the movement. We can all be essentially the superheroes that I mentioned today earlier, superheroes and super stewards, and that's our job to do so, and it's our job to lead all those around us on that same path. So I want to applaud all of you for being here and for your involvement in this journey towards health and peace. So thank you.
I am here to tell you that because of technology, when it's used wisely, we are going to break down boundaries, borders, nationalities, and we're going to unify humanity over the next 10 to 20 years. My whole life I've gotten to rooms, and if I've had 1,000 people there to listen to me, that was a heyday. Now I can get on the internet, as we're doing here. Many of you are listening to us today or 25 years from now, and reach millions and billions of people worldwide. If we start to use this technology wisely and tell the truth, unwavering truth, without fear. And I loved what Jeffrey said. If you have no fear, you're not brave. And nobody should ever fear, you included, every one of you listening, the truth. Number two, I'm absolutely sure the destiny of humanity is to come back to normality. The destiny of humanity is to come back to normality. And it will happen in great part over the next 10 years. And some of the suggestions, Dr. Oppenlander said, yes, it may not in the next 100 years be your neighbor who likes to shoot deer that are going to change. But let's hold them accountable for that. Not in the way that they would hold the deer accountable, but in a loving way, in a compassionate way. And understand that not everyone, including me and every one of the panelists here, knew what we know now and could have called ourselves conscious before we went on this journey. So let's have the same compassion for them, understanding that all of us are in the process of learning more. None of us have it all figured out yet. And lastly, the most important thing is that you have got to take the energy in your mind, your heart, your soul, your consciousness, and put it to good use. Do not dwindle it away and waste it by worrying. What's going to happen? Who cares what's going to happen? You know, who cares what's going to happen? What's going to happen is what you make happen. You're in total control. Your whole life, for centuries, they've been trying to take that away from you. But you're in total control. I'll go back to what I said earlier. I've never seen any movement that mattered. I've never seen anything important ever happen that it hasn't been one person. You. Let's picture you. Not me, not we the leaders, not the truth about health. You that made that commitment will make the change. It's a ripple effect that becomes a tidal wave, that becomes a tsunami, and 30 years from now, people are going to be saying, you mean to tell me people ate meat and dairy food? You mean to tell me people got under an animal that wasn't of their species and drank from its breast? You mean to tell me we robbed little eggs from a chicken? You mean to tell me that we literally thought we were so smart that we could outdo nature and evolution for billions of years, and we genetically modified food for somebody's profit? One company or two companies' profit? You mean to tell me that when people were sick, we never once asked for the cause of why you got sick? We just had the remedy, and the remedy was worse than the cause? You mean to tell me this? And when you really look at what is normal today, it's got to be laughable. Because if you don't laugh, you'll cry. You'll cry 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, saying, how could we have gotten this crazy? So laugh. Have fun. Enjoy. You're okay. God's here. Everything's going to be fine. Just become you again.